Gracias por la invitación. Es un placer estar aquí en Chile, en Santiago, la primera vez. Pero voy a ir con mi colega a ir a hablar en inglés, mi presentación. Uh, Trump and risk have become almost synonyms now. When in my industry, which is the industry of political risk, Eurasia Group, we try to anticipate future trends. We try to anticipate events, and it's been, of course, very challenging to do that now in the world last year and this year with these more and more unpredictable elections that we've seen, not only in the case of the United States with Trump, but also in the case of Brexit in the UK. And looking at this year, what we have ahead of us, a few important elections in Germany, in France, and elsewhere. Of course, it's very challenging. And as my colleague here, Jeffrey, said really well, he kind of set the framework here of the Trump psychology. I think that will play an enormous role on how the United States behave over the course of the next few years, and will delineate the landscape for a lot of the countries in Latin America, in particular as well, how they'll need to understand this new landscape and what can they do to mitigate the risks and potentially seize some opportunities. And I do believe there will be some opportunities. So, but let me start a little bit expanding, I think, on what Jeffrey kind of highlighted it very eloquently, that, you know, the first concept of Trump is the concept of America first, right? It's the concept that it's not isolationism, I think. I think it's a different strand than pure isolationism that we saw in the United States back in the 20th century, you know, after the First World War, when they decided to opt out of the League of Nations, etc. I think it's more because there will be presence in the world. There will be U.S. activities around the world, but there will be the main driver will not be the promotion of universal values of the U.S., like democracy, human rights, but rather the promotion of U.S. interests. So where it makes sense for the U.S. to be, they will be there. So it's not completely isolationism. So that's kind of it's more just seeking pure concrete interests, and that's a slightly different than isolationism. So we do think, and we here in the business of trying to predict the future, you know, trying to make sense of what may happen. I think there are three key sources of risk of a Trump administration when it comes to the world. The first one, of course, is the power vacuum that it will create. It's not isolationism, as I said, but it is definitely a new way of dealing with foreign policy and with international relations, meaning that there will be somewhat of a retraction of the U.S. in several issues and several areas, right? So this means that there's going to be more inward looking, of course, and that will rebalance some of the main challenges in the world. For example, in the Middle East, where, you know, you have failed states, you have a very frail situation. The U.S. having less of a participation in Middle Eastern issues definitely will produce more instability and more risk. It's an example. This power vacuum that Trump represents also is a clear reminder of similar trends that we may see, you know, in other places that we started to see already in Europe with Brexit, and we may see now with the rise of the right in France with Le Pen. We may see now in the weakening of Merkel in Germany and other examples as well. So that can lead, of course, to a more unpredictable, I think, world. We at Eurasia Group call this it's a first geopolitical recession since the Second World War. I mean, as is highlighted here by Jeffrey, the U.S. has had a number of economic recessions since the end of the Second World War, but this is the first political or geopolitical recession, meaning that where institutions, where the global order are being challenged to a great extent. And this brings me to my second risk of Trump, which is the obvious risks as well, as the weakening of global institutions that may lead to fragmentation. More fragmentation, the weakening of global institutions and global regimes. We can talk about climate change, the deals that were reached in the last year and last 2 years. We can talk about, the weakening of the UN. There's also a lot been said by of the questioning of the NATO's relevance in the world as well, and of course protectionism. Right, we've seen these calls for protectionism, the undermining. Well, I wouldn't go as far as say the undermining of the WTO, because the U.S. last few years, the U.S. has never paid that much attention to the WTO, but of course other trends like the TPP, etc. And finally, the third risk that we see from a Trump administration is managing the rise of China. I think this is something that, so far there's been some friction, of course, with the rise of China, but given Trump's some of his psychological features and his tweeting habit, it does bring a lot of risks to this relationship. Just remember that just a simple phone call to the president of Taiwan, was unprecedented. 40 years without any kind of direct communications between the president of the U.S. and president of Taiwan generated a lot of concern from China, and of course, depending on who he appoints, this means that China and of course, Trump's reduced interest in intervening in a lot of places in the world will give China more space potentially, and especially in Asia, when you talk about the presence in the South China Sea, with the North Korean peninsula under a state of alert. Now we think that this is a key risk for this year. That of course this Trump, the unpredictability of Trump may escalate this problem in North Korea if it becomes a problem this year as well. And also, the relationship between the U.S. and China on the economic level as well. There are talks about, potentially a trade war that could lead to a currency war between the two countries. There are all these sources of risk that it's not going to be easy to manage this new balance between the U.S. and China this year, and that could definitely create a more bumpier road in 2017 at least. So these are the three key risks of Trump. Now, one thing that I think it's less obvious when you talk about the Trump administration and the impact that it may have for Latin America is this. Of course, we're all focusing on the risks. We're all focusing on the negatives. But we need to kind of distinguish that there may be actually two moments of the Trump administration particularly when you look at his domestic policies or his economic policies, when you look inside the United States. Of course, outside of the United States that I highlighted the risks, these risks are obvious. But when you look inside the United States, his main promise is to make America great again, right? What does that mean in terms of economy? It means to try to boost economic growth through an expansionary fiscal policy. That means more growth. And if he does deliver on that promise, or at least on part of that promise of bringing in more growth, spending more on infrastructure, cutting taxes, etc., that will, if you look in the next year, maybe two, that would generate more growth in the United States. And, you could even have a positive impact on commodity markets, right? Just more demand from the U.S. for construction, for infrastructure. So it actually, in the short to medium term, you could actually have a positive impact on commodity prices and positive impact for commodity exporters. So a lot of emerging markets, including in Latin America, including Chile, for example, there could be a positive side effect in the short to medium term. Now, we were talking yesterday at lunch. We could call this somewhat of a sugar rush as well. I mean, it's not necessarily good when you look at the longer term, because of course, if this plays out, as I'm saying, if you have growth, if you have this expansionary fiscal policy, you're also likely to have inflation, meaning that you'll have pressure at a second moment where this inflationary pressures will put pressure on the monetary authorities to raise interest rates. So beyond the risks of politicizing monetary policy in the U.S., and that's a risk that we see globally with these new, more populist leaders emerging, that you have more pressure on monetary policies across the board, not only in the U.S., but you see in England, you see in potentially in Europe and in the U.S. But a scenario of higher interest rates in the U.S. would, of course, create pressure on currencies across the globe, especially for emerging markets currencies, and also bond markets as well. And that's not a very good backdrop, I think, for a lot of these, a lot of the emerging markets. So emerging markets that were already facing some troubling winds even before Trump, now they're facing more and more a more complicated environment with this unpredictability in the political front and also in the economic front as well. Now, looking at Latin America more specifically, I think, of course, there are the obvious risks, right? I mean, it was highlighted here. The two big, key, obvious risks in Latin America is Mexico and of course, the trade issue, obviously. Mexico has its hands tied. It can't do much. And that's an area, trade, that Trump can do a lot of damage without Congress. And also there's Cuba. Potentially the unwinding of the opening with Cuba. I think that the Mexico one, of course, in fact, the Mexico one, it's interesting that risk with Mexico could, change the Mexican political landscape over the course of the next 1 or 2 years, potentially with the election of a left-wing leader in Mexico, like AMLO, like López Obrador. In Cuba, I'm more skeptical to think that Trump will just reverse the opening. I think that he'll need to deliver something to his base in terms of criticizing Cuba, potentially even demoting the ambassador to Cuba to the way things were before, but without actually changing this reversal of some of the measures. Because if you look at who is interested in opening with Cuba, it's U.S. corporations, hotels and restaurants, and because Cuba is a frontier market for the U.S. It's kind of a black hole from a market perspective that a lot of U.S. corporations want, and a lot of them are supporters of the Republican Party as well. So of course, Trump will have to play this balance. And so these are the two obvious risks, Mexico and Cuba for the Latin America. And, more broadly, when you talk about protectionism, I think that the end of TPP, right, that does have a major impact, not only in the TPP countries that are part of the region, or the Pacific side of the region, but also non-TPP members of Latin America, like Mercosur countries, for example, that TPP was going to have a major impact on the trade flows across the board. So, of course, this is a very challenging environment. Now, the challenging environment for Latin America actually precedes Trump, right? When you look at, so it's not as if we can't make the case here that, before Trump everything was good in Latin America. It wasn't. I think Latin America is coming out of a decade of growth, of solid growth, mainly driven by a commodity boom, the cycle, a Chinese demand commodity cycle. A lot of countries benefited from this over the last decade or so, with the exception of Mexico, because Mexico's economy, 80% of it is tied to the U.S. Mexico, in fact, China was a competition, was a threat to Mexico industry, whereas for the rest of the Latin America, it was more of a positive news. So this commodities, this economic super cycle that happened in Latin America over the last decade or so did generate a political super cycle in the region, right? Where the high commodity prices, high growth rates allowed governments to implement policies, social policies, cash transfer policies, and active industrial policies in the region that boosted popularity. Lula and the PT in Brazil, Chavismo in Venezuela, Correa in Ecuador, Morales in Bolivia, Kirchner in Argentina, and the list goes on. So you can see very high approval ratings in a lot of these regions. But then the commodity cycle went down. China slowed down a bit. Commodity prices went down a bit. The economy started to slow. So the economic super cycle came to an end. What's going to happen? What happened to the political super cycle? We saw what began to happen, the fact that because there's a byproduct, there's a more permanent byproduct of this growth in the region that was the growth of middle classes in a lot of the countries in Latin America. We have a study that shows that throughout that decade, the middle class became the largest class in most of these countries in Latin America over the course of the decade. In the case of Brazil, for the first time, the middle class became more than 50% of the country. It was roughly 30% in the beginning of the decade. And that story plays out in Colombia, plays out in a lot of these countries. And that's a political story. Because of course, we talk about middle income trap, how middle classes behave economically, but we look from a political perspective how middle classes behave politically. Whereas when they are below middle class, they have more basic interests, more basic concerns, which is core economic issues, jobs and income. When they have that, because of the success of the economic, of the favorable winds of the global economy, not necessarily success of economic policies, but more of a more favorable environment, when they have that, their demands begin to change, begin to become more sophisticated. They want what we call the quality of life agenda, which is education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. And that's not easy to deliver, right? It's kind of the opposite challenge China has today. China, the challenge for China is to move away from an investment-led growth model to a consumption-led growth model, right, to create a consumer market. In the case of Latin America, particularly in Brazil's case, it was the opposite challenge of moving away from just a purely consumption-led growth model that was successful to a great extent to more of an investment-led growth model where you need to boost productivity, competitiveness, et cetera. And there's no easy way out. So this translated into weaker leaders. The PT Lula came to an end in Brazil. It was through a very tense process. Kirchner lost in Argentina to Macri. You have Venezuela on the verge of a breakdown with Maduro now. But you have the policy pendulum and the political pendulum in Latin America moving away from the left towards the right. It's not a seamless process. I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is a Washington consensus redux. It's not. But you have the pendulum moving away from the left towards the right. And in a lot of these countries, maybe the exception will be Mexico, as I highlighted before. But the interesting thing is here is this, and I'll conclude here, just these brief remarks, is that Trump's election does highlight the risk of the return of populism and nationalism around the world. And you've seen that not only in the U.S., you've seen that in Europe. What does it mean for Latin America also? Will this be the return of, could this be the return of populism and nationalism in Latin America? I'm not that pessimistic here because I think we've come out of that recently. And I do think that the strain of discontent differs a bit in the U.S. or in the developed world and in the emerging markets world. In the developing world is the discontent of a declining middle class. In the U.S., the Rust Belt of white blue-collar workers. They're thinking that their jobs are being exported abroad, and to some extent that's the similar story in the U.K. with Brexit. So it's kind of a declining middle class, the decadent middle classes that are complaining. This translating into more protectionism, translating into almost xenophobia to some extent. It would be an extreme version of it. In the case of in Latin America, I think it's the other way around. It's not the discontent does not come from a declining middle class, but actually from a rising middle class that is demanding more from their governments. So the answer to that is not necessarily protectionism. The answer to that, it's not necessarily isolation. The answer is actually reforms. It's not that obvious, but that's what we're seeing in the region. That's what we're seeing Macri in Argentina trying to implement reforms, particularly in those countries that are kind of lagging behind. If you draw the famous Tordesillas line in the region, now not between Spanish and Portuguese America, but between more open and pragmatic countries, the Pacific side, and less so in the Atlantic side. I think that the Atlantic side, Mercosur countries, are governments there seeking these reforms to adjust the post-commodity boom hangover that they went through. And that's the case of Brazil today with reforms. That's the case of Argentina today in a context that's much less favorable now, given what I highlighted with Trump. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is just basically nationalism that will manifest itself again in Latin America. So, and to end, what can Latin America do, or what will be the challenges, I think, going forward in terms of trade, more specifically, and strategy, and how to deal with this more risky world and with this imperative of a lot of these countries to open up, to reform, to continue these reform process going, and to try to mitigate the risk. I think it's the first obvious here is highlighted is that by the previous panel is that a convergence between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur. I think that should be one key priorities. And the sad thing to say about particularly Mercosur countries, Brazil and Argentina, is that finally, after a decade, unwilling to talk about trade, Macri and Temer in Brazil, that now they're finally said, oh, now we're willing to talk trade and to negotiate, but the party is over, right? The world is not willing to do that anymore. Europe's not willing to do that anymore. The U.S. is not willing to do that anymore. But there may still be the remnants of the party in Latin America, where I think Pacific Alliance and Mercosur should seek more. We'll have opportunities to seek more of a convergence at some point. I think China will be an interesting challenge for Latin America. Some countries already have that relationship more, but others need to build on that, because China does have a more structural interest in Latin America, that as the Chinese economic model changes, their presence in Latin America will move away just from purely export-driven, but also seek to invest in infrastructure, something that the region needs a lot. So I think that's going to be a very interesting possibilities there. And finally, the issue of multilateral institutions. I think that the weakening of these multilateral institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the Inter-American Bank, the WTO, et cetera, is a challenge, is a risk for everyone. And the emergence of alternative institutions like the Asian Bank led by China, or even the BRICS Bank, they should not be seen as threats. They should be seen as complements to complement, I think, these other institutions, to cooperate more and more. The Asia Bank in Asia, the BRICS Bank that could have a broader role as well, to fill in the gap of this power vacuum that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So I think there will be opportunities. I think, of course, but agreeing with my colleague, it's hard to predict. It's going to be a very, a tweet may change all my presentation depending on what Trump says, and if it leads to an impeachment of the president. But I'll end here, and thank you. Muchas gracias.